And good morning, everybody. Just first a quick sound check. Can everybody see and hear as well? If so, can maybe somebody leave a message in the chat?
Yes.
Okay, Alexander can hear us, so let's then assume
a royal visit.
royal visit. Well, without further ado, welcome to this new webinar on developing your new resilient growth strategy. We're continuing our series on webinars in which we share best practices on driving growth through innovation, which is basically what we do for our customers. All our webinars, by the way, are available on demand on our website. Rob, who is sitting next to me, not visible, but he will share the link in the chat.
Yep. Yeah, and also we, in addition to these podcasts or webinars, we also recorded a couple of podcasts. They're also available at our website. For example, we did a podcast with KLM on building their innovation studio, Blue Labs. We talked about the importance of innovation in sports with representatives of the Dutch Olympic team and the Ministry of Health. And there's a link to the podcast on YouTube and on Spotify. We'll make that available for you. And also, it's also nice to get some of your feedback. If you know, what do you really like? You know, what are the things that we can do better? What are the things that we can improve on? So please let us know, such that we know what to pursue and we know what to kill. So thank you for that.
Okay, and well, just to introduce ourselves, for those of you who are new to this webinar series, my name is Mark Dauma. I'm partner at RevelX. Next to me, my colleague, partner, Matthijs Rosman. We will be host for this webinar today. And as always, I already mentioned him, we have our commercial lead, Rob Nouwens, behind the controls. He's going to make sure that everything runs smoothly. He will also pick up your questions from the chat. And of course, along the way, we will try to answer some of those questions. Just a couple of words on RevelX. We're a boutique consultancy. We help our clients to realize growth through designing and building future-proof growth strategies and innovation strategies. We work for large corporates, also mid-sized businesses, and even smaller scale-ups aiming to become a corporate. And we have quite a bit of experience in a range of different industries. For today's webinar, we will be focusing on how can you build a resilient growth strategy for your organization. And we have a couple of topics that we will address, which you can see outlined on this screen. We're going to talk about our growth strategy canvas. That will be the main methodology that we will discuss, which we apply a lot, by the way. Furthermore, we also like to give you ways to think about your growth strategy from both an external as well as internal perspective. For example, how to read the industry you're in, how to respond to competitive threats, how to make sure you have a strong foundation for growth, and also what will be your key drivers for sustainable growth. We like to keep these webinars interactive, so please, join in the chat. If you have questions or suggestions, just raise them in the chat. We will address them along the way. We've also prepared some polls, which you can participate. So, let's go with the webinar.
Yeah, thank you. So, just to get started on that, I think we're going to launch our first poll just right away, just to get you involved in the session, if you will. So the first poll, and Rob will launch it for you. You will see it on your screen, and we want to ask you, how confident are you about the resilience of your growth strategy? And maybe I should point out that your growth strategy is something different from your corporate or organization strategy, but we'll talk about that during the session, obviously. So please let us know, either we don't have a growth strategy, we're building a growth strategy, our growth strategy needs an update, or we have a clear and resilient growth strategy in place. So let us know, where you are with your organization. And if you are a consultant, for example, working for an organization or maybe in an interim basis, just obviously, you can answer for them, huh? Right?
For them,
yeah, exactly. So, so we're seeing a bit of a mix of answers here. So a couple of people said we don't have a growth strategy. We're building a growth strategy. Our growth strategy needs an update. Just be aware that either you don't have one or you need an update. You're going to get a call from Rob. So so be careful. Yeah. Just be aware.
You've been warned in advance.
Exactly. So again, a bit of a mixed bag in terms of answers, but just hopefully you'll find some interesting and valuable information in this webinar. Just to kick it off. everybody's looking for growth, obviously. So growth obviously is a driver for performance. It increases shareholder value. It drives culture. It builds employee satisfaction. Everybody wants to be part of a growing organization, and helps to retain the talent in your organization. Obviously, it also fosters innovation. Growing organization, an organization which is looking for the new. That'll help, and obviously it also helps you build influence in your market and your industry. The thing is that growth is not self-evident. As I said, most companies are looking for growth, but the majority of companies actually do not manage to maintain a level of growth which is sustainable. And obviously, there are a lot of factors here, but what we're obviously seeing is that companies are facing a lot of headwinds. There's volatility in the markets, economic uncertainty, shifting market conditions. Obviously, the gentleman in the second picture has something to do with this recently. So we're all facing geopolitical developments, specifically trade policy uncertainty and supply chain disruptions that we've seen in the last years. There's also a lot of talk about AI having and technology in general having presenting challenges for companies, but also opportunities, obviously. A lot of our clients have to deal with labor market shortages. We just can't find the people to do the work. It's in various industries, ranging from companies like KLM to more in industrial service providers, who we work for. And then lastly, changing regulatory compliance and compliance demands are also sort of putting pressure on companies' growth trajectories. So there's a lot to deal with when you're looking to grow with your company.
Maybe just only because of these headwinds that we're continuously facing, achieving sustainable growth is probably one of the hardest tasks you will face in business. By the way, with sustainable growth, we mean that the company, earns more than the cost of capital needed to realize those earnings, which in itself is already a modest definition of growth, because actually you want to achieve much more. However, most companies are actually unable to achieve sustained growth. It sort of, they manage for a couple of years, but then because of the reasons Matthijs just outlined, they face headwinds. And actually a decline sets in. And research shows that around 15.5 to 20% of the companies actually only that number grows sustainably over time. So then the question, I think is already almost answered, is why do you need a growth strategy? Because most of the companies actually don't realize it. By the way, when if you look at 90% of these companies, they have detailed strategies with much higher targets. But the sad reality is that most of these strategies are not strategies at all. They're rather goals. We want to double revenue, or they are too generic. They can apply to any business in the industry. And as a consequence, you end up, with the risk ending up with a graph like this. And it seems like a bit of a stylish graph, typical. But this is actually taken from a real life example. It was a 2 billion turnover company. We've compared the plans they had for a number of years, looked at the growth trajectory that they sort of aimed for, which were the dotted lines, and the actual performance was actually way below that. And then the question, of course, is how come? And that led into, as you can imagine, a whole strategy exercise to actually get to a different level of performance.
Maybe this is a good segue into Stefan's question about why do you say growth strategy is separate from your company strategy? We separate a growth strategy from a corporate strategy because we feel that organizations need to have a focused strategy, which obviously is derived from the corporate strategy, just to drive growth in a structural way. When we often see that organizations don't have a very focused growth strategy, they basically deal with the most generic or the most corporate, the highest level strategy, but then very quickly go down to a very operational level of sort of managing their companies, and that growth strategy basically sits right in between the middle of the translation of the corporate or organizational strategy to actually driving that growth muscle.
Well, and for that, thank you, Matthijs, for that explanation. Because in the past 30 years, by the way, RevelX exists for 11 years, but we've done this work already 20 years before that. We've supported many businesses in defining their growth strategy. And we've seen many lengthy presentations. I think we all know them, right? The big decks. And sometimes we make them with all the analysis, but in the end, it really comes down to what is the well-defined ambition and action plan for achieving growth. And for that, we've, at some point, I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago, we've developed the RevelX Growth Strategy Canvas, which we're going to explain throughout this webinar. And the strategy canvas typically helps you to define the key elements of your growth strategy on one single page. Actually, just yesterday, I finished one that we're going to discuss this afternoon at one of our clients. And it really is a highly condensed version of that very elaborate strategic plan that structures the dialogue with key stakeholders in your business about what are our challenges, where do we see the opportunities, what is our ambition, and where do we sort of achieve growth, and what are the actions that you will implement to realize the ambition. Especially the last part is often, I wouldn't say neglected, but it's overlooked. It's overlooked, and it's not managed with discipline. We'll talk about that later on. Since we've developed this, we've used it in numerous strategy projects. Just giving you some examples. We would have loved to talk about the content of these strategies, but for confidentiality reasons, obviously that's quite hard. But if you look at these companies, it's a wide range from relatively mid-sized companies like Nadelco, Merford being a specialist in sound solutions, shaping sound or enhancing people's well-being through sound. Really interesting business. To Huisman, making very large offshore equipment for the offshore wind and the oil and gas industry. To BDR Tunia, operating in the climate solution field. So a range of companies from large to small. And what we always see, it really helps them to sort of have a consistent approach. It works for both small and large. It gives structure. And it also helps to create a common language, especially if you're in a multi-business unit business, working with one of them as we speak. It kind of creates a common framework around what do we want to have in our growth strategy.
Yeah, that's correct, and it's good you mentioned that single language. And as a matter of fact, we're working indeed for an organization which is recently merged. It's a fairly large organization, probably 2 million in revenues, or 2 billion in revenues, I should say. So 5 different business units that need to work together on driving growth, and this is really helping them sort of shape their growth story, and having a sort of a single language about how we drive growth. So if you dive a little bit deeper into the canvas, you'll find that it's built up in a couple of blocks. So the first one is what we call the growth context, which is, let's say, the outside of your company. It talks about what are the disruptive trends in the industry, obviously positive and negative. How is the customer landscape changing? What are the evolving needs of your customers? What is the course of your competitors? Where are they going? Where are they heading? What do you see there? And where do you see market growth potential? Then to the bottom left corner, we'll go to the growth readiness. We'll look at how your organization is equipped and ready to start growing. What are the weaknesses that inhibit growth? What are some of the strengths that we can leverage in our growth strategy? And obviously, having a good growth ambition is key, which is a part in the middle. With the growth ambition, which basically we derive from the corporate or the company strategy. What is our company's BHAG, or big, hairy, audacious goal? How are we going to transform our company, to realize our growth ambitions? But also, how are we going to measure, whether we know we're on the right path? So, what are going to be our SMART goals? And then the true part, or the actionable part of the growth strategy is about, so what are my growth engines and growth enablers going forward? And we'll dive into that topic a lot more during this webinar. So and then finally, and then the right part is all about execution, right? So obviously the key to strategy is to execute. Otherwise, it's of limited value. As we said, so the goal of having the growth strategy, and you've seen in the slide that Mark just showed about the different growth strategies that one of our clients had, is to close the growth gap, and the growth gap really is sort of the difference between your current course of action or your current performance and your ambitions. And it really, growth strategy helps you allocate the resources to dedicate them to the right areas in business which actually drive growth, and put the competence and talents where you need it. And so having this sort of growth strategy in place also helps you on a course of action, which will basically put you on a different course than your competitors. It provokes action, and these are all things that having this growth strategy in this actionable form in place will help you do.
Yeah, and maybe to pick up on Veronica's question, so why do you need a growth strategy canvas, and why is it not enough to work with the business model canvas? I think the business model canvas is an excellent tool when you want to think about how your future business model is going to look like and how it's going to differ from today. But all of you familiar with the business model canvas, I think you also know that it's not actually defining your growth strategy per se. It defines the transition. And so we quite often use it, and just keep that in mind when we're going to talk about the transformation that a business needs to make. I'm working now for a very large OEM, so they make stuff, but that stuff is going to be much more digitally connected. So in the future, they will really have a much more digitally enabled business model. They need to think about services. They need to think about remote monitoring, predictive maintenance, performance contracting. So their business model is going to change fundamentally. And we're using the business model canvas to define how the future will look like. So you can feed that into your ambition, you can feed it into the transformation. But the business model canvas doesn't really define where you want to grow. So that's how you can sort of combine them together.
You're right. And basically, so I was just talking about this, or the 5 integrated businesses I'm working on currently, and the business model canvas I think is a great tool, and it really helps us to create a snapshot of what's the current or the as is of each of those companies. But it doesn't have that actionability that the growth strategy canvas has.
On that note, another poll coming up. Rob, I think you already started it. So the question we have is, which of these building blocks would you feel in general is the least well defined? Would that be the context, the growth context, the external part, the growth readiness, the internal part, the ambition transformation, the growth engines and enablers, or the growth execution?
Okay, interesting.
We're not getting a lot of answers, by the way, so a couple of people still.
I think this is, although you're right, it's not that many yet, but I think it's fairly. If I just look at the work that we do, people always have a fairly good sort of understanding of their their general heading, right? Their North Star. Their ambition. When it comes to basically how do we drive growth, what are the thrusts behind our growth trajectory? Those things tend to be less defined, and I think that's also reflected here in the poll.
The growth engines and enablers being the least well defined. I think most companies, they sort of know that they need to define an ambition in their strategy. But then quite often it kind of stops there. So, okay, now we've set the ambition, everybody knows that, it's clear, and then we all assume it's going to happen. Which, is reality is that it's not going to happen if you do not put something behind that, which are what we call the growth engines and the growth enablers. Okay, so let's look at a bit more detail now at some of the building blocks of our growth strategy canvas, starting with the ambition. And as Matthijs already said, every good strategy needs to have a grand ambition. Where do we want to be? What is the impact that we would like to achieve? It kind of outlines the desired future state of your company. And quite often we see growth being defined in terms of financial performance, market share, customer-based growth, so more the stuff that you can measure actually, preferably financial as well. But we like to take a broader perspective because although these are very relevant KPIs, growth should also be about the value we want to create for our customers, the innovations we want to bring to the market, and the impact we want to make with that, the social and environmental impact, not to forget, and also things like brand equity and reputation. So the ambition should preferably be defined much broader than just we want to grow market share or we want to double sales. First of all, that's for a lot of the employees not very inspiring, but it's also much too narrow and it doesn't really define where you want to go. Because we feel, that the ambition should really serve as the guiding star for planning, decision making, resource allocation. Typically, we would like to take like a 3 to 5 horizon here. That's already quite long. Well, just look at what's happening around us in the world today. I think
it's very unpredictable.
One week might already be quite long there. At the same time, we sometimes work for businesses where a really longer term perspective is needed. For example, Huisman Equipment, I already mentioned them. They're in the wind industry. We're talking about 10 to 20 year scenarios there because developing an offshore wind farm already takes like 7 to 8 years. Building their equipment 3 years. So they're used to much longer horizons. It doesn't really help to only take a 2 to 3 year perspective because what they're going to build in the next 2 years, that has already been contracted. So it's not going to make a difference. So sometimes you really need to take that longer term perspective.
And obviously, Mark just talked about growth numbers and market shares, but you do need to have your, let's say, your SMART goals in place, right? So what are we looking to achieve? How do we know we're on the right track? But those goals, obviously, they need to include market shares and the portfolio that we want to develop, but also has to dive a little bit deeper into what percentage of revenue, for example, comes from innovation. So if we tend to see a lot of growth from the core, obviously, that's key. But how are we going to use innovation to drive growth going forward? And also, have SMART goals about how do we see the satisfaction of our employees and customers, reflected back in our growth strategy for the years to come. I think one element that we also would like to highlight in terms of ambition is what kind of transformation do we want to make as an industry. You talked about this before, but growing faster than the market or growing faster than your competitors often requires a transformation. You need to do things, differently, and I do a lot of work with Abbott in the diabetic care industry, for example, and Abbott's CEO often says, what got us here won't take us there, right? So we really have to think about, how can we become even more successful. Thinking about transformation, how will our business look different in the next years, 3 to 5 years, for example?
Where the business model canvas really is handy,
exactly.
to make that. To define that.
Exactly. So how does our business model have to transform? How do we transform, for example, we see a lot of our clients want to go from transactional sales to more, solution sales. How does that, play out in terms of our products and service portfolio? What are the kind of customer relationships that we have to develop? What kind of strategic partnerships do we have to put in place to drive our growth? And what are the new capabilities for success? So really think about, if we sort of, put our company, far away in the future, so what kind of growth steps or transformation steps have we made?
Yeah, and then maybe one last point about the ambition, Matthijs. I think it's also very important, and I know you agree with that. So I'm not talking to you about just, it needs to be inspiring and motivational, and it needs to be something that people can relate to, that they can actually remember. Not like, if you wake them up at night, they can sort of speak out what it's going to be, but it really needs to be relatable to people. And the sad truth is that only 5% in general of the employees fully understands the company's strategy. So strategy development, it's really also about storytelling and communication, and really making sure that it's really translated down to the level of individual employees, what it means for them in probably much more tangible terms than the often more abstract strategy definition.
I think that's really where the canvas helps.
Well, so we talked a lot about ambition, and in the ideal world, you start defining your ambition with a blank sheet of paper. But in reality, we have to deal with the business context. That's often more challenging, and you also have the heritage of your business. So you are where you are, and even though you say, Matthijs, what got us here won't get us there, or something like that. But a good assessment of your growth opportunities and also your growth readiness, that's really essential. And looking at the outside world, we're looking for a free perspective there. So that's the industry shaping trends. So what are the main trends that might really transform your industry? How are customer needs evolving? Whenever we do strategy assignments, we always ask if we can speak to at least 5 to 10 customers. Very insightful to have those conversations, and often much appreciated, by the way, by customers as well, because they really feel that you're taking them seriously, that they can have input. So customer interviews, not only for smaller innovations, but even for your group strategy or your corporate strategy or your growth strategy, really important to do. And also look at competition. Well, let's look a bit more closer at these 3 topics.
Starting with industry shaping trends, we often I had a discussion yesterday with the CEO of the company we work with, and he says, I spent 95% of my time with operational shit, just to put it that way. So where is our industry heading? Do you allow yourself the time to look beyond the horizon and really understand what's shaping your industry? Do you have time to follow industry reports? Can you look at customer stakeholder feedback? Do you take the time to look at the impact of technology and innovation on your business? And I think this is also really where AI is a big can be a big helping factor to start use AI to start asking questions about the industry that you probably never asked before. And when I wrote the book Dare, together with our former colleague Eric, we talked about the rarely asked questions, and I think that's really where AI can help you to ask those rarely asked questions, so the questions you don't ask yourself anymore. So really have an open mind to where your industry is heading, and just look at some of the facts. For example, demographic shifts, regulatory changes, global economic trends. Those are probably the more obvious ones. But also trying to look for those questions that are maybe less obvious. The other one, and you talked about it in the introduction of the 3 perspectives a bit more, is to look at how are your customer needs evolving. And I think this is a really important one. You should really talk to your customers and beyond, let's say, the commercial discussions that you're having with your customers, because then you're always trying to sell something, right? So you're in a different type of relationship. Obviously conduct surveys, talk about implementing customer advisory boards, for example, interviews, mapping out customer journey, where does energy come in and where does energy leak out, and do this with an open mind, right? Truly try to listen to what your customers are trying to tell you, and not try to sell them something. It's really about encouraging them to be brutally honest. And I think it's also worthwhile to point out that sometimes you can be too close to your customer, right? So if you've been, we are working with a lot of companies or in industries where you have a very tight relationship with their customers, and you sort of morph with them, and you get the systemic mirroring. Your company starts to mirror the business of your customer. Be aware of that. And also be aware of the fact that sometimes your customer is just as siloed as your organization is. There's one company I worked with last year in the food processing industry, and they did business with large corporates, but they only talked to one part of that large corporate, and they forgot to see that there are 4, 5, 6 other divisions that probably needed the same services, but they just didn't talk to that customer, right? So be aware that your customer could be more silent than you think.
Well, and then obviously you also need to look at your competitive landscape, and I think everybody kind of knows that you need to look at your competitors and try to learn from them. But then the question is, are we looking at the right competitors? Because we've seen many examples where competition emerged from unexpected directions, And incumbent players were not really picking up on the signals. And for example, the entire German car manufacturing industry, I think they're struggling part because of that. And sometimes the landscape does change a lot. I've worked for 8 years now for a business which is in security management, which is often a very traditional installation business. So we just install stuff, and then the building is secure. I think it was like half a year ago, we compared the list of competitors that we were looking at 8 years ago with the competitors we're looking at now, and they were fundamentally different.
Completely different. Yeah.
And what happened is that instead of the traditional installation companies, we're now looking at software companies who said, well, this is actually a digital play, and we need to have software as a service business models. And they're international businesses investing millions and millions of euros or dollars, if you like, in developing these platforms. And they're hugely successful. So their whole industry has transformed from being physical to digital, entering new competitions. And therefore, it's really essential to have a vision on how your industry might be disrupted and what the impact will be. By the way, we have an interesting webinar on disruption also on our website.
That's a good plug.
That's a good one. And then the question is, of course, to compete or not to compete. So that's the question. We tend to make everything a competition. There's some people in the White House in particular. But it also can lead to conformity. It can lead to unprofitable business. So what if you would refuse to compete if you take a different approach and separate yourself from competition and potentially join forces with competitive players and change the rules of the game? So, I think that outcome, I've done a PhD on strategic alliance a long time ago, by the way. But if you cannot fight them because you don't want to be, you can also join them because it creates more value.
Yeah.
So that's, I think,
reshape the industry. Huh? Yeah. Okay. So moving to let's say the internal side of growth. So to what extent is your organization ready to grow? Do you have the fundament in place to grow your business, effectively? We often do sort of a full analysis of organizations' growth readiness. That's also very valuable. But what really sort of boils down to is, so what are the strengths in your organization that you can leverage, and what's some of the weaknesses that you should sort of try to overcome? If you look at sort of, let's say, your internal growth drivers, they tend to be the capabilities that you have that drive value, and how do you leverage them? So what are the unique strengths that drive your business model in your or your competitive, advantage? And obviously, those can be brand equity, technical expertise, capabilities, customer relationships, and stuff like that. But the real valuable capabilities also are the more softer elements of your business that really stand out and drive the value for your organization. The other part, obviously, is what's holding us back, right? What are the growth inhibitors that we're facing within our organization? And obviously, you can make that assessment yourself. But as Mark when he talked about, discussing this with your customers and engaging with your customers in a strategic dialogue, they're often very, very able to tell you, what is actually holding your growth back and what's inhibiting your growth. And just having that discussion also with your customers is very powerful and reveals a lot of insights. Yeah,
that's true. And then quite often, I think most businesses, they are familiar with the SWOT, and it's I think very old. It's very often used.
You talk about battle tested.
If you talk about battle tested, there you have one. What we often do not see is how that then translated to insights and action. So then we have that list, and what we often do is make that SWOT confrontation, and that leads you to a quadrant, which is on the screen right now, where you actually think about which strengths can be used to take advantage of which opportunities, and which strengths can help us to actually neutralize some of the threats. So that's kind of the good part, but then we also may have weaknesses that actually hinder us to capture opportunities, which we will then later on address in the growth enablers. And you really should be worried if you have a number of weaknesses that actually aggravate some of the threats. And that's where, it's really urgent to take action. And I think especially this one, I now work for a business where the threat is that digitalization is going to fundamentally change the business model. Their weakness is they're not a digital company. They're basically a traditional hardware manufacturer. So there we have a threat and a weakness that really do not line up and is really potentially threatening.
Yeah.
So that's really crucial. A short question, by the way, from Ben. Do you use AI a lot in your company on a daily basis? Well, I think
Absolutely.
We do. Absolutely every day, especially when looking at external developments. It's amazing, as one of those commercials from the old days would say, but it's really amazing what you get out of that. And I think, making these analyses is greatly supported with the use of AI. On which we, by the way, have another separate webinar, and I will stop playing those webinars now, Matthijs.
Just go to our website, go to the warehouse.
Yeah, we have another poll coming on, which is actually an open one. So we would like to invite you to leave some comments in the chat. So what are the most important internal growth inhibitors that you see in your organization or in the organization of your clients if you work as a consultant?
Yeah, I'm really curious to see where that goes. Okay, I think we're on to the topic of growth engines, right?
Oh, so we're skipping the answers.
Well, I'm not seeing any, so if we're
okay,
just
then we'll just move on.
we'll keep responding to them as we see them go. So just just please share with us your most important growth inhibitors in your company.
Yeah. So when we kind of know the business context, when we appreciate our growth readiness and we've set the ambition, it's really time to sort of turn on the growth engines. And well, as Matthijs already explained, that the goal of your strategy is to close the growth gap, to really the gap between your current performance and your ambition. And the growth engines, those are the strategic product market combinations and initiatives that generate sustainable and scalable growth. It's not about doing your daily job of selling products and services. Growth engines, they are really the strategic priorities you want to focus on and invest in, and they should give sort of the focal point for future investments.
Yeah, and if you look at the closing the growth gap, we tend to see, or actually we're looking for a mix of growth engines, right? So we distinguish three of them. Obviously, the first one being growth from the core. So the core business, the core markets that you're already in, basically the business that drives your business today. How can we leverage that? How can we get more value out of that? As Mark explained, we've been in this business for a long time, and I think if you add up all of those strategies and all of those plans, we see that 80% of the growth, sustainably and continuously comes from driving more out of the core,
which is good.
Which is a good thing,
because that's also they're likely the ones that have the high success rate in general.
On the short term, yes, exactly. Yeah. So the second element to think about in your growth mix is adjacencies or breakout spaces. So considering my core business, what are other areas of growth for me as a company? So are there any geographical markets that I can sort of grow into? Are there other parts of the clients I'm already working for? Can I sort of repurpose the value elements of my proposition into other areas of the market? That's adjacencies. And then obviously the third element of the growth mix is what we call an innovation or transformation of the business. So we're really building new business models, really reinventing or completely transforming your business into something new is in their area. And indeed, as you said, it's that's a more risky element. And I'm just looking at Stephen's comment on the growth inhibitors, focusing on paying for acquisition before putting the hard work into driving repeat purchase, retention, and referral. Very recognizable, and is indeed something that also ties into this discussion about about driving growth from innovation and transformation. So do I really know about, what an innovation will bring in terms of value? Obviously, it's basically an innovation play where you have to test your hypotheses going forward. So just to do a little bit of obviously you'll be able to download these slides, after the session. But just a couple of words on how to grow from the core. We tend to say, growing from the core is a game of, commercial excellence, right? So some things you have to do well is product management, so enhance, the performance of, current offerings, improving the value of your customer relationships or getting closer to your customer, and what can we do in terms of cross and upselling. Where can we expand, geographically? So what are the areas where we're already strong? Where can we drive more value? And also, how can we strengthen the brand? How can we reinforce that positioning, or just improve the overall, customer experience? Those are things that are in the known category. So they're just about, being more, apt in your commercial approach. Building adjacencies is a bit more tricky, right? So, and that requires, a thoughtful approach into, how do I diversify my business? Maybe I can bundle or package my, offerings in a different way. Can I find new customer segments? And then obviously the question, do I have a relevant position with those customers? Can I find new strategic partnerships? Can I do business model innovation? And one of the things that we see a lot, and you just talked about, becoming more of a data or an AI company or a data-driven company, is we see a lot of our clients who are looking to grow through let's say, secondary growth stream, which is called data monetization. Now more and more with, things becoming more and more as a service, let's put it that way. We see that the companies, they grow, the data base that they have, or data lakes, and they're trying to see if there's some value there. Obviously, this is quite a tricky area, because you have to be very conscious about, what kind of data can I actually sell, and you get into a very different sort of domain. With that.
That's true. And I think especially on this last part, building adjacencies, it's really important. Sorry, I need to click one there. It's really important to be aware of the fact that you're often trapped as an organization in your own conception on how you add value.
Yeah. What is my company? What is my business?
We've done this for 20 years. We know how it works. But the downside of being in the industry for so long is that, and dealing with the same customers, and you already talked about sometimes being too close to your customer, is that you lock yourself in a position that's kind of hard to escape from. And we always try to, and that's one of the fun things about our work, we get hired not to sort of repeat what the CEO thinks, but we actually get hired to challenge stuff and ask those rarely asked questions.
And be creative.
And really challenge the dominant myths and beliefs. And I think if you look at your own business, I think you will easily find a number of beliefs and even myths that people sort of started to believe themselves. And I've never questioned, actually, even though the environment has changed a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that the challenge is always to find those myths and beliefs and to have that open debate about them and to rethink your view on the business. Because otherwise you're always stuck in the same core that you were, and well, that's not going to help you forward in a future environment that might be fundamentally different from the one you've been working in so long.
But it does require sort of let's say a psychological safety just to have that discussion with we. And actually recently had an experience with one of our clients in which we organized what we call a rounds of the night table, where we basically sat together and talked about, okay, so what do we actually believe to be true about our business and our industry, and what are some of the things that we have to reconsider, and that dialogue, which we planned to do for an hour, took up three hours and was a major element into sort of building their new growth strategy. Yeah.
So that kind of brings us to the next building block of our growth strategy, which are the growth enablers. And we like to look at growth enablers as the internal improvements that are really preconditional for firing up your growth engine. So because often there's a lot of sort of internal stuff that can be done better. Yes, we can optimize processes. Yes, we can have, we can make better use of CRM systems and so on. And the list is often endless. But looking at your growth strategy and bringing focus on sort of the internal improvements, then you really need to ask yourselves, what is the stuff that is really preconditional for developing or actually realizing my growth engine? So if your business is going to be a digital business 5 years down the road, and if you don't have digital competencies, well, you'd better start making that a priority right now, because otherwise you will not get there 5 years down the road.
Yeah.
And then everything else is of a lower order priority.
Yeah.
So the internal enablers, they are not like the growth engines, the direct drivers for growth, but they are critical for realizing it. And they kind of make sure that your company is actually fit for future growth.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to give you some examples of what are those growth enablers, what can you think about in terms of growth enablers? It's the support infrastructure, right? It's your technology, your processes, your systems, which are integral to your business, but also resources. What kind of resources do I have? So if I'm transforming my business, can I still do that with the same people? Or can I still do that with the same amount of capital that I have available? Do I have to look for other sources, for example? It's also capability building. It's skills, knowledge, competencies, organizational alignment. So how do I make sure that my organization is aligned with strategy, with the culture and the goals, not only the goals and structure of today, but also of the future. And one of the other things is obviously about resilience and adaptability. How do we make sure? I think there's this research being done about the Standard & Poor 500. I think the halftime of a company now is sort of down to about 10 to 15 years. So that, if you want to survive over the long run, you really have to build a resilient and adaptable organization. I'm also looking at the time, but also looking at some of the questions that are asking. I think maybe one about Stephen, about this. Do you find this varies between Dutch versus other European companies? And that, I think that question was put in when we talked about myths and beliefs. I don't generally see a difference in terms of a type of company in terms of being a Dutch or other European. I think it's what industry are you in? What's the makeup of your management team and also the tenure, I think. So I think it becomes more of an issue once you get into management teams and organizations with people with
leadership.
Exactly, 25, 30 years of experience. I think that's more of a distinguishing factor rather than where these companies come from. Yeah.
Okay, well, having said that, a couple of, not last words, but at least addressing the last part of our growth strategy canvas. And as we already said in the beginning, this is the part that is often overlooked or at least not done as well as it should be. Because, how often have you not seen strategy plans where you kind of looked at and then asked the question, okay, what has been done since then? Did you follow up on it? Have you monitored progress? And then quite often the answer is, well, actually, we did not.
We were trying to run a business.
And we're kind of we're kind of tied up with all the operational priorities, and that's that's also a reality that we have to work with. But still, if you do not translate your strategy into actionable plans, and even more important, if you do not execute them with discipline, the strategy will in the end just be a paper exercise. So an integral part of the strategy canvas is actually the action planning, and you really should define those actions that are relevant and essential for delivering your growth engines and the enablers. And there, be careful that you cannot make action plans for 3 to 5 years. It's always good to take that 1 year perspective, a year and a half maybe for the initial programs that you're going to start on. And also be aware that what we quite often see is that, okay, we have these like 100 actions that need to be taken, and then we're going to all do them in the first half year.
Yeah, with the same people.
With the same people, because it always comes down to the usual suspects. So be careful there to make those plans realistic and also think about, can we actually execute on them? And this is where, especially where if you make sure that strategy is still strategy and it's not operations.
So one of the key things when working with our clients is to make execute on strategy. It's about the growth mindset of autonomy and entrepreneurship. So that's what a lot of our clients are looking for. They're looking for people who have that specific mindset, and they ask their team. So just act as if this is your own company. With Abbott, for example, we've instituted the founder's mentality as a leading principle, just to have people sort of take that responsibility.
If you were the founder of this company.
Exactly. If you were the founder of this company, how would you react? But the real and then so this is obviously very let's say it's a very trendy thing to talk about. But the reality is that a lot of companies, or most executives, they don't really want this entrepreneurship, right? They're looking for the traits, they're looking for the outcome. They basically say, act as an entrepreneur, but make sure you don't fail. You stay within, aligned with the strategy, and you don't bypass approvals. But still, we want to see, entrepreneurial outcomes. And I think this is a really stifling, paradox in a lot of organizations that we see. Okay, act as an entrepreneur, but you don't get the mandate to do it. And I think the key here is to really, to set the right metrics for these people, by which their performance is measured. For example, on KPIs that reward learning and not so much outcomes, right? So I think that's a key thing also to look at for in your company.
Yeah, and especially that mindset is so important, because in the end, the strategy is not a fixed thing that's not going to change, because we all know, and Matthijs already explained in the very beginning of this webinar, that external events that will really that will inevitably impact your strategy, and so the plan you're going to make this year will most likely not be the plan you would make next year. So it's important, not to be too rigid about that approach, and not say, well, we have a 5-year plan, we're not going to deviate from that. You need to have that entrepreneurial mindset, adaptability along the way, to make sure your plan sort of stays relevant, which is all about staying agile, on which we could host a whole separate webinar, which we're not going to do today, because we only have 5 minutes left here.
Yeah, exactly. So what we tend to do is to adopt sort of a rolling strategic planning approach, like Mark discussed. Don't make plans for stuff you're already doing. That's operational stuff. Just focus on those things that move the needle in the next year. But also make sure that you make scenarios for major uncertainties. Obviously, we've seen things over the last couple of weeks which nobody could have predicted. But the thing is that just keep an eye on what's happening or might happen in your industry, and how are you going to respond to that in an effective way. But at the same time, not to get on too much of a dwelling course, is just to maintain that North Star vision, right? To just keep a close eye on where your company is heading, where your industry is heading, what kind of role you want to play there. But with that North Star vision in place, make sure that you allow for short cycle reallocation of resources based on those market signals. And I think that's also one of the key strengths of sort of using the canvas, is that you can sort of use that approach and use that structure to really refresh that frequently. It says adapt your strategy as you go. Well, and that's really meant to be the right part of the strategy.
Yeah. And for example, I think it was in November last year, I said together with Ensecure, a company I've been working with for 8 years already, we have that strategy summarized in our growth strategy canvas. We spent a day and a half with their management team looking at, again, the external environment, reassessing the growth engines, and actually we've done the full exercise a year before then. In a day and a half, I think it took me like 2-3 hours at max to sort of refresh the canvas, and everybody was on literally the same page again. That's a saying we often do, everybody needs to be on the same page. Well, if you have your growth strategy summarized on one single page, it's much easier to be on the same page, to be honest. And it saves a lot of work as well. Not so good for our business, but I think it's all about adding value.
Absolutely.
And staying tuned to what's happening in your environment, adapt your strategy, and look at the projects that need to be executed for that. One of the other benefits, With that, and with only 4 minutes left on the clock.
3 actually.
3 actually, yeah, and counting.
I think we have a couple of questions.
Yeah,
Maybe
we're at the end of the
yeah.
webinar, so then
Yeah.
do we have time for 1 or 2 questions?
I think so. Let's go to the Q&A. I think I thought Mick's question was quite interesting about realizing growth in the core. Oh, can you go back? Thank you. Growth in adjacencies or transformational growth requires different horizons. Yes. What's your experience in allocating scarce company assets over those 3 growth strategies? Yeah, I think that sort of the gold standard has been said is so if 80% of your growth comes from the core, then there's 20% of your of the business left or resources left to look at adjacencies or transformational growth plays. If only it was that predictable. I think what we're seeing is that 90% of energy goes to day-to-day stuff, and then hopefully there's just a little bit of time left to think about the future. We have varying experiences with allocating resources to long-term goals. Or actually long-term of transformation or adjacent strategies. Obviously, one is just to carve out a piece of the organization to really focus on sort of next level plays. That can work really well, provided that you don't lose connection with the main organization. Obviously, it requires a certain set of capabilities which you may or may not have in your organization. Another option, obviously, is to basically put it outside of the company and have somebody else take care of that. But that I think aggravates the risk.
That's a risk in itself.
Yeah.
And I think the point being, guys, if you have defined your growth engines, and if you even quantify them and try to sort of think about what they can deliver, that is also sort of the guidance that you can give to allocating your resources. So it helps you in many ways.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would like to respond to is Steven's comment about remunerating people, not harming the status quo. Yes, I think that's a dead end path. If you find that you're in an organization where people just basically say, okay, whatever you do, don't rock the boat. Just put your head down and keep going. I think that's the end of the line for that company. So if just maybe you should do a regular check to see if you can still rock the boat and grow.
Yeah. And then we're 20 seconds
yes.
left in time. So I'm going to close off together with Matthijs. Thank you, Rob, for making it all possible again today. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed and found it at least useful. If you have questions, reach out to Rob and we will answer them. For now, I wish you all a very nice day.
Enjoy.